I am delighted and thrilled to be able to welcome one of Ireland's leading chefs, JP McMahon, to the Irish residence here in Ottawa. And I should say welcome to Canada, but it's not your first time here.
No, it is possibly my sixth or seventh or even eighth time. So there seems to be some wonderful networking being done at the moment between Canadian food and Irish food. So I keep on coming back and keep on cooking, and there's some Canadian chefs coming over to Ireland and cooking with us. So yeah, no, it's very good.
Yeah. And you've always had a great focus on the local sustainable. You found that here in Canada too.
Yeah, very much. And sometimes I think the food movement in Ireland and in Canada, both are very young. We're still trying to find out like who we are and what distinguishes us from other types of cuisine. So since coming to Canada in 2012, I have met a lot of friends who are chefs, and we all seem to be on the same trajectory of investigating local food, looking at wild foods, looking at certain or various indigenous plants and trying to use them in cooking to give it a certain sense of terroir.
Yeah. Is there a sense of recovery of more indigenous native cooking, or is that always been there and we're just kind of discovering it now?
I think to a certain degree it's in both. I mean, I think that I suppose it's probably harder to see in Ireland, because when you think of like indigenous Irish cooking, I mean, you probably have to go a long way back.
Yeah.
In terms of indigenous Canadian cooking, you could go back a couple of hundred years, and then you have a continuity to engage with. So probably similar to countries like Australia.
Yeah.
But in Ireland, it's you really have to go back to certain periods of time, like the Neolithic or the
Gaelic Irish.
And it's a little bit more difficult. But sometimes you're taking poetic license to a certain degree, because you find out that seaweed is an important ingredient, but like you don't necessarily have any historical records of it, when you go too far back, because in Ireland the first writing is about 600-700 AD. People come to Ireland 10,000 years ago. So we have like 8,000 years of unrecorded history in Ireland, where we have lots of game being eaten, lots of shellfish being eaten, lots of wild herbs,
garlic,
all of that.
Yeah.
And so you kind of have to piece it all together and go, well, you know what, there was a load of fish, there was a load of wild garlic, there was hazelnuts. Let's make a dish of fish with hazelnuts and wild garlic.
Now, you're known for the kind of the great cookbook of Ireland that you've recently written, and was a huge success. What have you learned from Canada that you didn't know before you started coming here in terms of cooking? Did you learn something? Or like even an ingredient?
No, definitely. I mean, Saskatoon berries.
Okay.
And I spent time in Toronto, in Vancouver, and in Calgary. We went up to the Rocky Mountains on a big cooking trip for 10 days a couple of years, about 2016, and that was a great mix of learning from indigenous peoples about what they used, and then what we spent a week cooking, and then we kind of came up with different things. But I remember a dessert of Saskatoon berries. And even though I suppose the people would see them as too stereotypically Canadian, and maybe it's the same for us with an Irish stew or with a Guinness or something. But I think what happens is when you come from elsewhere and you taste the ingredient, it's for the first time, and then you get a certain kind of, oh wow, that's a really amazing ingredient, and the Canadians would say, oh, we've had that for years.
It's
nothing special, but you're like, no, this is something we don't have in Ireland. So look, I'm always interested in those things, and even today out chatting in Springfield Farm with some of the herbs that some of the chefs, really beautiful Canadian sumac. And that's something we don't really get in Ireland. So freshly ground sumac, really beautiful spice. So there's because it's a little bit the climate is a little bit different, you have a certain amount of more kind of homegrown spices that you wouldn't have. Like traditional Irish cooking is very unspiced until you have, say, like the Anglo-Normans come in and bring a lot of spices into Ireland. And that's not to say there's no place for spices in Irish cooking. It just means that we didn't have them for a long period of time. And so for me, it's always interesting when recipes use spice, because then you can kind of see, well, what period, what period of time are they coming from, and that. So that's interesting.
So you're over here for the Springfield Farm Field to Feast Festival. You'll be working with Indigenous Chef Joanna, for example, and that's going to happen this weekend. But for now, we have you here in our residence. We have a fine fellow here, halibut. Do you want to explain what you're going to cook today?
Yeah, halibut is a really, really beautiful deep sea fish. It's quite meaty, so a lot of people like it. Often people like eating fish when it's not very fishy, when it's more meaty. So halibut, turbot, monkfish, all of these fishes. So what we're going to do is we're just going to fillet it, and then we're going to bake it with some fennel, which is over here. So some nice fennel. We have some seaweed from Connemara. So this is kelp.
Yeah.
And it's something I love using because it's full of really deep flavor. And we're going to rehydrate the kelp in some water, and then we're going to bake the halibut with a little bit of butter and some sea salt from Ackland. We also brought over some little bit of pickled lovage from the restaurant to just to give it a little taste of Ireland.
Okay. Now, before you get going, you said Saskatoon berries were Canadian. From Connemara, is that the quintessential ingredient?
I think so. I mean, I think when I think of Connemara, I think of seaweed and lamb, you know, and so there are plenty of areas in Ireland that have distinct food identities, but I think sometimes because possibly the country is so small or our food culture is still growing, that we haven't really regionalized our food as much as we should have. But hopefully in the future we'll have different areas, I think, that will specialize, you know, and regionalize like the way they have in France. But I mean, Connemara is still developing, but when you get wonderful scallops, wonderful lobsters, lots of nice shellfish, mussels and clams, and so I like to combine all these different things. So it's not unlike Canada. You have a kind of meeting of land and sea, and so you often have these things going together, and then you kind of play on those things. We're going to use a little bit of butter, as always, to make it taste nice.
Right. Well, I deliberately didn't wear an apron in case you got me to do something, so I'm going to step back and leave you at it. Yeah, great.
So guys, so as I said, we're going to cook this beautiful halibut, and we're going to bake it in the oven. And firstly, what we're going to do is we're going to make a little bed of fennel. And I'm just going to chop the fennel, and we don't need the fronds parts. I'm just going to take out the root of the fennel, and we're going to slice the fennel up nice and thin, and that's going to create a bed to support the fish. And one of the most important things for cooking fish is to have an oven thermometer with you, because a lot of people worry about overcooking the fish or undercooking it. So I think it's really, really important to have a little food thermometer, and they're very inexpensive. And when you're cooking fish, no matter how big or small, you're always looking for an approximate temperature of about 50 degrees Celsius, and in that way it'll help you keep the fish nice and juicy. And if you don't have fennel, you could have any vegetable really under this, as long as the vegetable doesn't take longer to cook than the fish. So you could go with a courgette, you could go with some peppers, you could go with a leek. I probably wouldn't go with something that was too strong, like maybe like an onion, unless you cooked the onion beforehand. So I'm going to move that over. Next thing, our ingredient is a little bit of seaweed. So this is kelp or kombu from Connemara in the west of Ireland, and we use this a lot in the restaurant. Most of you will know this ingredient from Japanese cooking, but we produce a lot of it in Ireland, and it is really, really full of natural umami flavor, which is somewhere between kind of sweet and savory. And if you look closely at the little spots, what you see, the white spots in the seaweed, is kind of natural monosodium glutamate, and this is what really gives the dish a nice flavor. So we're going to rehydrate the seaweed. You can put it in dried if you want, or if you live by the sea, wherever you are, kelp is quite common all over the place. So we'll give that a few minutes to rehydrate while we prepare our fish. Okay, so of course I'm going to fillet this halibut, and actually this is a small halibut, if you can believe it. Halibut could be the size of the table, and I'm just going to take a few pieces off. But of course your fishmonger can do this for you. So I'm going to take just cut it straight down, because here you have the kind of center loin of the fish, and this is the belly of the fish. If you wanted to cook this for a party of 8 to 10 people, you could just cut the tail off and trim it up here and put it on the board in the same way that we're doing. And the recipe that I'm doing, which is from the Irish cookbook, is actually for a whole fish. But if you can't get a whole fish, you can just improvise. So I'm going to take this off the bone, nice and gently. And the most important thing when you're filleting a fish is just to have a good sharp knife, and the rest should be fairly easy. So guys, I have my fillet of halibut, and this, if you buy a central line piece of fillet of halibut, this is the way it will look. So what we're going to do is we're going to portion it up, and I'm going to try and create nice even pieces. And the reason for this is because I want to try and cook the fish in a kind of consistent way. In the restaurant, we always take off the top and the bottoms, and you can freeze these and then use them in fish cakes if you're buying fish a little bit bigger. But if you leave them on, I find that because the fish is thinner here and here, then it ends up being slightly overcooked. So we'll do 4 nice portions, and then yeah, that should be fine. And then what we're going to do is we're going to season them. So we have some beautiful Achill Island sea salt, and we'll season the fish. Now what you can do, if you're doing this ahead of time, you can season the fish very, very lightly a day ahead. And what that will do is it will actually draw moisture out of the fish, and it will help it cook better. Because when you're cooking fish, it's full of water, and it's very easy to lose a lot of that water. So by salting it beforehand, what you do is you help the proteins stick together, and it actually retains a little bit more moisture. Brining the fish is something similar. So we're going to create a few little beds. I'll bring this over here. So 4 little fennel beds. Do is we're going to season them as well. So a little bit of salt, and then we're going to take some nice cold pressed rapeseed oil, and this guy is from Canada. But actually, one of the interesting things that occur in Canada and in Ireland is that the only oil that is produced in Ireland is rapeseed oil, which is called canola over here. So it's the only oil we use in the restaurant. Okay, now underneath, in between our fennel and our fish, we're going to put a little bit of butter. And what this is going to do is this fat is going to help cook the fennel, give it flavor, but it's also going to enrich the underside of the fish. So just a couple of dots of butter. Unfortunately, butter makes everything taste nicer, and that's just the reality of things. Butter is a fat, and fat is something that we all desire because our brains want fat to keep going. Okay, so we're going to take a little bit of our seaweed, and as you can see now, the seaweed has rehydrated, and normally seaweed will rehydrate up to 6 times its equivalent. So if you buy 10 grams of dried seaweed, you'll probably get about 60 grams of fresh. So we're just going to put a little bit of seaweed on each one. We're going to oil our fish. And the fish has no fat in it, or very, very little fat, unless you're talking about salmon or mackerel. So it's important to oil the fish. So we've given it oil and we've given it salt, and now we want to give it a little bit of moisture. So we've taken some cider, and cider is, we're using Canadian cider, but cider is a really great Irish drink. A lot of people call it like the wine of Ireland, because again, cider is made from apples. And there's loads and loads of different craft ciders being produced both in Ireland and in Canada at the moment. So any recipe that calls for white wine, you can use cider for it. And if you think about it, what you're replacing a grape flavor for an apple flavor. And a lot of people will associate pork with cider, but cider works really, really well with fish. So we're going to put this nicely on top of the fennel. And then we're ready to go into the oven. Now, this size fish should take about 10 to 12 minutes at approximately 180 or about 307 degrees Fahrenheit. But the best thing to do is, if you're cooking it for say 10 or 12 minutes, you want to check it around 5 or 6. And the temperature, as I said, you're looking for is about 50-55 degrees. Anything really over 55 degrees Celsius is a little bit too cooked. And 50 degrees Celsius is the equivalent of rare for meat. So you really are trying to cook your fish a little bit less. And the mistake we make with fish is that we cook it as if it was meat, and then we find a lot that it's overcooked or that it's dry. So to avoid the dry fish, you make sure you have nice salt, some nice fat, whether it's oil or butter, and then you have some nice liquid, whether it's wine or whether it's cider. So I'm going to go put that in the oven. Okay. Okay, so we've just taken our halibut out of the oven, and it is about 55 degrees, so it's good. I mean, I'm looking for about 50, but to be honest, anything between 45 and 55 is good, depending on your own personal preference. Some people like to eat the fish a little bit juicier, and some like it a little bit more cooked. So hopefully you're
doing this for it's essentially less than half an hour. I mean,
this is about 12 minutes. So if you wanted to do halibut for 10 people, then you just line it all up, and then you.
But from start to finish, this is
about half. Yeah,
about half an hour. Yeah. It's amazing.
And you could do some spuds on the side.
Yeah.
You could do a more complicated sauce. But we're literally going to take the oil that is mixed up with the fish and the fennel, mix it with a little bit of our lovage vinegar, and that's going to create a kind of vinaigrette. So it's going to be a nice kind of light seafood dish. So I'm going to pick it up, and what I'll do is I'll take the fennel first. I'm going to put this down here.
The fennel looks great because it's slightly caramelized. Yeah, it looks fantastic.
Fennel is really great in that regard. So we're going to take a little bit of lovage, and lovage is a herb that not a lot of people use nowadays. It is it's in the celery family, and it has a kind of celery flavored. But when celery came into Europe in the 19th century as a foodstuff, it was always used medicinally before that. That and rhubarb, for whatever reason. So lovage, as you can see, is really, really small. And it grows about this height. But when celery came in, it just took over, and people were like going,
is that because that's too fiddly, or?
It's just, it looks, when it grows it looks a bit like parsley. But when you make a vinegar with it, it's very nice. So we can just put a little bit of vinegar over it, and that is going to do instead of our acidity, instead of our lemon. And then I'm just going to get a little bit of our oils.
And you're saying in Ireland you only cook with rape oil because that's rapeseed oil?
So in Anise we just use cold pressed rapeseed oil, sea salt, and then our own acidity. So it could be seaweed vinegar, could be lovage vinegar, and then we don't use black pepper, or lemons. Just to make our life a little bit harder, a little bit different,
but more authentic.
But as my friend who is a food historian, Regina Sexton in Cork, tells me, it's completely ahistorical because black pepper has been in Ireland 1,000 years, and why we decide not to use it because it's not native is entirely down to us. You could say that we were part of a historical moment in 2008 2005, 2008, were very much following the Nordic example, when countries, I suppose, rejected the kind of, or sidestepped the French model, and began to look at what they produced themselves. And then they questioned, well, why do we have lemons on everything? Why do we have black peppers on anything? Is there any other type of acidity or type of spice? And you could say that that's been going on over the last 15 years or so.
It's kind of a great adventure, but if you're putting together Ireland, Canada, the Nordics, it's kind of a North Atlantic.
It's very much on that same spectrum. And even when I forage over here, we find very similar mushrooms, herbs, sometimes slightly different. But it is like foraging and using wild food. It's a great way to encounter a landscape for the first time. So even when I was in Australia, we went, and I can't even remember them now, but we found so many different herbs that do not grow in Europe and all have different tastes. And then when you use them, when you're cooking a piece of fish, it just gives the fish a slightly more kind of terroir driven taste.
But you would need to obviously know what you're doing. You need an expert because you can't eat everything.
No, that's absolutely true. So you always, I was with one of the tribe leaders, and they showed all of the different bush tucker that they use. But so absolutely
great.
So that is your.
Well, I have watched an awful lot of cooking shows from the wrong side of the screen, so I'm really excited to be this side and able to taste something.
There you go.
Should I dig? I'm going to dig in.
The proof is in the pudding, so let's just hope it's nice and flavoursome. Good.
Yeah, no, that's really. It's actually very moist. It's incredibly moist.
This is what I mean by when you cook fish.
I'm just trying to get some of that. Fennel
when you cook fish. So even when you break it down there, you've got so much moisture inside it, and it's still slightly translucent.
Yeah, and it's very. It's kind of it's kind of hefty. It's a good solid kind of meal.
Halibut is very much a fish that kind of mimics the some of the profiles of meat, and that's why it's quite popular.
Listen, JP, that was great. That's absolutely fantastic. Thanks so much for coming along here and for showing us some of your skills. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.